For some sports news, Malawi is in the Women's Africa Cup of Nations for the first time, and they're playing in the final against Cameroon this Sunday. That means they've also qualified for the Women's World Cup in Brazil next year. Against all the odds, Malawi got here by beating Algeria, who finished third after winning against host Morocco on penalties last night. To discuss women's sports and coverage, we can bring in sports journalist Charlotte Richardson. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us today. So I want to begin with a couple of figures, so bear with me. Women's football is projected to have over 800 million fans globally by 2030 and become one of the world's top 5 sports. The 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup was the most viewed women's sports event in history. It had a nearly 2 billion global audience. But that same year, while they awarded $150 million in prize money, a 300% increase over 2019, that was only still a third of the $440 million the men got in Qatar. So why does pay parity still plague women's sports?
It's a really good question to ask. And I think trying to simplify the answer, women's sport historically has been under-resourced, underfunded. And in the last few decades and in the most recent years, when we've seen an increase in visibility, when we've seen the grassroots game through to the professional game have the investment that it deserves and more eyes on the sport, the growth around it all, we're seeing those audience figures build. But the infrastructure and the planning sometimes behind women's sports lags behind the professional men's game, not just in football, but in other sports as well, where it's had many, many years of growing and of professionalizing. Women's sport does lag a little bit behind, and perhaps that's epitomized even with WAFCON itself, which was due to take place in March this year. Then just 12 days before the tournament was due to start, it got postponed back to this point of the year as well, which you just would never, ever see happen within men's sport.
Now, as we were just discussing there, audiences are growing for female sports. 7 out of 10 people now regularly watch women's sports. Almost 73% say they watch it a few times a year. That's not too far behind the 81% who say the same about men's sports. So as we've been discussing, we're seeing this increase in frequency, but why doesn't this translate into better coverage of women's events?
Product around women's sport has grown to a level now that there are more and more eyes, and people repeatedly, whether it be in the stadium or behind a screen, on their devices, through content creation, are consuming women's sports. That's because the narrative is compelling. We see incredible female talent triumphing, suffering defeat, success, displaying aggression, skill. It's compelling. And what we need to do is build that visibility with regular slots. And what women's sport, and in particular women's football in the current format that it's at, is sometimes it finds itself competing with men's sports for prime time slots. But what we're beginning to see is that if you place women's sport at a prime time, if you do all that you can to put it on terrestrial channels, not behind paywalls, removing those barriers, the audiences will come. We need to build the infrastructure both on the pitch and away from the pitch, and we will continue to see the growth and that visibility, not just on TV screens, but like I say, through social media stats, through advertising, through that commercial growth, which is really important to make women's football and women's sport as sustainable as possible.
Now, here in the United States, the WNBA had just signed a record coverage deal. Their finals air prime time in the U.S. Now, you cover sports. Do you notice a difference in the amount of attention and resources given to covering different events?
When I started my career about a decade ago, you really had to champion and campaign almost to get coverage for women's sport. It has completely transformed, I would say. There's still a lot that can be done to improve, but in terms now of any young boy or girl being able to access women's sport through free platforms online, through social media, through turning on their TV, there are so many more opportunities now to become enchanted and fall in love with the story. That's why we all love watching sport. It's compelling. And what we really notice with women's sport as well is the importance, particularly for young girls, to have female role models that they can aspire to, that they can be inspired by. And that doesn't just have an effect, again, on generating income, but it boosts sport and the participation figures that we see in our grassroots game. And the studies show that if young women and girls can have a healthy relationship with sport, if they can remain active, that doesn't just improve their physical health, but their mental well-being. And it also really sets them up for life as well, building really good communication skills, becoming a leader, dealing with difficult circumstances. That then helps them through their careers, whatever that may be. So it's improved, but I still think there are lots of things that we can do to ensure that it grows better and better.
Charlotte, I want to ask you a little bit about potential cultural shifts or attitudes. I'm sure everybody has seen those clips that go viral from press conferences where someone asks one of the female athletes, "What are you wearing? Could you twirl in your skirt? Could you show me more of your outfit?" Questions that male athletes never have to deal with. So, are we? Is there enough awareness that kind of questioning is stopping, or are we still kind of stuck in that where we're not asking the right things?
Well, we've reflected upon how coverage of women's sport has changed over the years, and seeing more female athletes on whether it be a basketball court, a football pitch. We also need to see that reflected in our media as well. So that includes bringing more women into roles, whether it be courtside interviewing, whether it be commentating, doing call by call plays, to get more female voices into the sport, to again just ensure that the diversity we see in our society is reflected in the sport that we consume, but also educating people on the appropriate questions to ask and removing those stereotypes that people are interested in what an athlete wears. We're not interested in what they wear. We're interested in the way they set up tactically. How did that play unfold? How did they find that game? We want their opinions, and we want to pose to them questions that we would a male athlete, and remove that really outdated way of objectifying athletes based on what they're wearing, the style of their hair, and actually beginning to tell a far more compelling story. How did they get to where they got to in their careers? How do they deal with success? What do they do to become the very, very best athlete that they can be? How do they deal with defeat? How do they stomach that? How do they improve? And again, I think we're seeing that shift with a greater sense of visibility, but also the icons that we see in sport, whether it be Caitlin Clark or Leah Williamson, Alex Morgan. We've got really, really fantastic female athletes who are helping to break down those stereotypes. And when we reflect on the fact that we've got social media now and athletes have the opportunity to tell their own stories and take control of their own narratives and put their own content out there, I actually think that's really complementary to the way we then see broadcasting played when it comes to perhaps a live fixture or a live scheduled match.
Yeah, Charlotte, you mentioned social media there, and certainly that is a direct pipeline from the athletes to their fans. But it goes the other way. It's also a direct pipeline for trolls to harass some of these female athletes. So, what can be done to protect them from that?
Again, a really good question. I feel as a wider point, perhaps social media companies could do more to protect all types of account users, but especially for these prominent verified athletes. They are very, very visible. They're very high profile, and through social media, they can become extremely accessible. Therefore, I think they should have more measures in place to protect them from accounts where certainly it's unverified people behind those profiles that are sending abusive messages, and perhaps the consistent excessive nature of those. You have, of course, the ability to block, the ability to mute, and I'm sure most athletes have sort of safeguarding support around them in the form of their agents, the clubs that they might work for. But I think just generally culturally, there's a lot we should be doing online to make the most of having the opportunity to connect with the superstars we enjoy watching, but also respecting the boundaries that, as well as being superstars who we idolize, they're also human beings, and our conduct online is just as important as our conduct in person. But I think that's perhaps an issue that goes even wider than just the sports context that we're discussing.
And Charlotte, just a quick follow up. A study by USC and Purdue University, so this is talking about American media, showed that roughly 95% of total TV news and programs like ESPN Sports Center, the flagship sports show, focus exclusively on men's sports. So, how can we kind of push the media to do a bit better?
We need to ensure that the product of women's sport is the absolute best it can be, and investment helps with that, ensuring that female athletes have adequate facilities to train and develop their skill, providing them a platform that is one that they can excel, and then ensuring that the visibility is as vast as it can be, so that more and more eyes and ears get to follow the stories and the narratives, because the more compelling a storyline is, sport is the best drama of all. It gets us on the edge of our seat. It grips us emotionally in a way that very few other things can do. We need to ensure that that product is the very, very best it can be, so that it commands the headlines that it deserves, and that in turn that we monitor those figures and we see, because the figures speak for
Yes.
themselves. Like I said earlier, provide the platform, people will watch and people will enjoy women's sport.
Yes. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for sharing your expertise with us. And that wraps up this edition